Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely, always ready to dig into a new case.
Well, today we're headed to Meadowbrook. It's a small town that became the focus of, well, a pretty chilling mystery.
Ah, yes, Meadowbrook. This one really stuck with me. It reminds us that even in those seemingly idyllic small towns, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface.
Right, exactly. We're talking about the case of Anika. And this case was featured on the Thrilling Mystery Missions podcast. Have you heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, I've listened to a few episodes. They do a good job of bringing these cases to life.
They do. And in Anika's case, they really painted a vivid picture of Meadowbrook. It sounds like one of those storybook towns where life moves at a slower pace and everyone knows each other.
The kind of place where you think nothing bad could ever happen.
Exactly. And that's what makes Anika's story so unsettling. It disrupts that image of small town safety and forces us to confront a much darker reality.
Absolutely. It makes you question how much we really know about the places we call home and the people we share them with.
So let's start with Anika herself. The podcast described her as a really hardworking young woman. She had big dreams. She worked at the local factory and was saving up for a bicycle.
Yeah, that detail about the bicycle really got to me. It wasn't just about transportation for her. It was about independence. Like, think about it. In a small town where everyone knows your business, having your own way to get around, that's freedom, especially for a young woman.
It's like that bicycle represented a whole world of possibilities for her, all those dreams and aspirations.
Yeah.
And knowing what happened to her makes it even more tragic.
Yeah, it does. And it's heartbreaking because, well, one evening she just vanishes. The podcast doesn't give all the details, but the next morning her body is found on this deserted road outside of town.
And the details of her death are, well, they're brutal. She had been assaulted and murdered. I mean, can you imagine the fear and grief that must have gripped Meadowbrook after that?
It's hard to fathom. That sense of community that small towns often pride themselves on, it's shattered in a moment like that. Suddenly, neighbors are looking at each other with suspicion, wondering who among them could be capable of such a horrific act.
And to make matters worse, the podcast mentioned that the crime scene offered very little in the way of evidence. They found Anika's bicycle near her body, but that was about it. No witnesses, fingerprints, or DNA. It's like the perpetrator just vanished.
It's like they disappeared into thin air, and that lack of evidence is a common problem in rural law enforcement. Small towns often have limited resources. They might not have immediate access to sophisticated forensic labs or the same level of expertise as big city police departments.
So it's a double blow for a community like Meadowbrook. A horrific crime and limited resources to properly investigate it.
Exactly. And that lack of resolution just adds another layer of pain for Anika's family and the whole community. They're left with so many unanswered questions, this gaping wound that never fully heals. The case goes cold and the fear just lingers.
Welcome back. We're picking up our deep dive into the Anika case, still trying to wrap our heads around the impact this had on Meadowbrook. It seemed like such a safe, close-knit community.
Yeah, I keep coming back to that too. The podcast really hammered home how this crime just tore through that sense of security they had, changed everything.
And that's what's so disturbing about cases like this. It shatters that illusion, that unspoken agreement that small towns are somehow immune to these horrors. It's a stark reminder that violence can erupt anywhere.
It makes you wonder, how does a community even begin to heal after something like this? I mean, especially when there are no answers, no justice.
Well, it's a long and complicated process, but in a way, a community heals much like an individual does. There's that initial shock, the grief, and then comes the anxiety, that feeling of vulnerability. People start questioning their own safety. The podcast mentioned that people in Meadowbrook were organizing safety patrols, demanding more streetlights. Seems like they were desperate to reclaim some sense of control.
Exactly. Taking action, even if it's symbolic, can be a powerful way to cope with trauma. It's about regaining a sense of agency instead of feeling completely helpless.
But I imagine that undercurrent of fear, the suspicion, it lingers, doesn't it?
It can. That's where the role of law enforcement becomes so crucial, not just in solving the crime, but in restoring a sense of security. Even if they never catch the perpetrator, a thorough investigation can help rebuild trust.
But as we talked about earlier, resources are often limited in rural areas, right? That must make it incredibly difficult to conduct those kinds of investigations.
It definitely poses a huge obstacle. It highlights a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. We can't expect small towns to handle these complex investigations without proper support. More training, better technology, and more collaboration between local and state agencies. Those are all things we need to push for.
So it's bigger than just Anika's case. It's about building a system that can actually protect these communities.
Exactly. And speaking of systems, I think it's worth talking about the role of media in all of this. True crime podcasts, like the one we're discussing, can be really effective in raising awareness about these
Oh
cases.
yeah, for sure. I was hooked from the first minute. But it does make you think about the ethical implications. These are real people, real victims.
Absolutely. We need to be mindful that these aren't just stories. They represent real lives, real trauma. And that demands a certain level of sensitivity from the creators.
Well, this particular podcast ended with a pretty powerful call to action. They urged anyone with information about Anika's case to come forward.
And I think that message resonates beyond this one case. It reminds us that we all have a role to play in building safer communities. Speaking up when we see something wrong, supporting victims and their families, it's a responsibility we all share.
It's heavy stuff, but crucial to talk about. We can't let Anika's story be forgotten. We need to learn from it, take action.
I agree. And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to shift gears a bit and explore some potential solutions, looking at what we can do to address the issues we've uncovered.
Welcome back to our final look into Anika's case. This deep dive has really been a stark reminder that even in those quiet corners of the world, tragedy can strike, and it leaves a mark on everyone.
It's definitely been heavy stuff, no question. But, I think exploring these tough cases, it helps us learn and hopefully create some positive change. We've talked about the challenges, the systemic issues, and even how we approach true crime ethically. So now what? What can we actually do with all this?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? The podcast ended with that plea for anyone with information to come forward. But it also felt like a broader call to action. Like, we need to be more engaged citizens, more aware, more willing to speak up.
Right. It can't just end when the episode's over. We need to keep that conversation going. What can we do individually and as communities to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place?
I guess that's where I get stuck. Where do we even begin? Creating safer communities, supporting victims. It feels daunting.
It can be overwhelming, for sure. But honestly, even small actions can make a difference. For example, supporting those organizations that work directly with victims of violence. They provide counseling, legal aid, even financial assistance.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the investigation, wanting answers and justice. But we have to remember the human cost. Those families are left to deal with the aftermath.
Exactly. And beyond that direct support, we can advocate for bigger changes too. We talked about the problems rural law enforcement face, lack of funding, lack of resources. While we can contact our elected officials, push them to prioritize things like training, technology, victim services, things that make a real impact in the long run.
Yeah, it's easy to feel like your voice doesn't matter. But when we come together and demand better for our communities, well, that's when things start to shift.
And there's also the power of just being involved in our communities. Neighborhood watch programs, advocating for better street lighting, supporting youth initiatives. These things all contribute to a safer, more supportive environment.
So it's about being vigilant, but also compassionate, being aware of what's going on around us, looking out for our neighbors, and speaking up when something doesn't feel right.
Sometimes it's even about having those difficult conversations,
Yeah.
challenging attitudes that downplay violence or ignore victims' experiences. We need to create a culture where people feel safe to come forward, where they know they'll be heard and supported.
This whole deep dive has taken us to some pretty dark places, no doubt. But I do feel like it's also shown us a way forward. It's a path that takes courage, compassion, and a real commitment to making the world safer, to making sure stories like Anika's become less and less common.
We might not ever completely eliminate violence, that's the harsh reality, but we can work towards building communities that are stronger, more resilient, more just, and that's a fight worth having.
As we wrap things up today, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Anika's story is tragic. It reminds us how precious life is and how quickly things can change. But it's also a call to action. What will you do in your own community to create that culture of safety, support, and respect? Remember, even the smallest things can make a difference.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope that Anika's story, while heartbreaking, will inspire us all to make the world just a little bit better, a little bit safer.